We were looking at the heirs of Second Maccabees, and that's where I want to pick up this evening before going on beyond that. What was the last one that I gave you? I think I gave them out in a little different order than I had them. Did it have to do with the 2-year period? So we didn't talk any yet about who was the leader of the Maccabees? Okay, so that I gave them out in a different way. How many do you have then? 5 or 6? 6, okay. Okay, let's come to another one of these, and we've got several more to cover before we get through with Second Maccabees. The last one that we mentioned, according to what you're saying, is that Second Maccabees tells us it was a 2-year period between the profanation and the rededication of the temple, whereas First Maccabees tells us that it was precisely 3 years, from around the 10th to the 15th of December of 168 to the same period of 165, which makes it 3 years exactly. So with that being the last one that we gave previously, we'll start on another one tonight. That is, in Second Maccabees, we find out that Judas Maccabeus was the one who initially gathered the forces of the pious Jews to rebel against Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was the first leader of the group, instead of his father Mattathias, according to First Maccabees. There are a couple of passages. Second Maccabees chapter 5 and verse 27. Second Maccabees shows Judas to be the initial gatherer of the pious Jewish people, the gatherer and the leader of them, whereas First Maccabees shows that it was his father, Mattathias. The familiar account of his father at Modin killing the Jew who steps forward in the place of Mattathias to offer the sacrifice that was demanded by one of the envoys sent by Antiochus IV, as well as the envoy himself. So after the verses before this, we have in 2 Maccabees 5, we have Antiochus attacking the city, verse 27, but Judas, also called Maccabeus, with about 9 others, escaped into the desert, where he and his companions lived in the mountains, fending themselves like the wild animals. They remained there, living on what vegetation they had, so as to have no share in the pollution, that is, the pollution that was offered by the Syrians. And then the first 7 verses of chapter 8 sets it forth in more detail. That just gives us a prelude to the Maccabean revolt, because in that portion of 2 Maccabees, in chapter 5, we're still really in the pre-Maccabean section, from chapters 3 to 7. He's wanting to get over to 8 to 15, which is going to deal with the Maccabean revolt. But unlike First Maccabees, it deals only with Judas. It doesn't deal with either the father or his other 3 brothers, or Mattathias' other 3 sons. Verse 1, meanwhile Judas, also called Maccabeus, and his companions were making their way into the villages unobserved. They summoned their kinsmen and enlisted others who had remained faithful to Judaism until they had collected about 6,000 men. They invoked the Lord to look down and help his people, whom all were trampling underfoot, to take pity on the temple profaned by impious men, and to have mercy on Jerusalem, which was being destroyed and which would soon be leveled to the ground. They prayed him also to give ear to the blood that cried to him for vengeance, to remember the infamous massacre of innocent children and the deeds of blasphemy against his name, and to show his hatred against wickedness. Once his band of partisans was organized, Maccabeus proved invincible to the Gentiles. For, this is the reason why he was so successful, the Lord's anger against Israel had changed to mercy. Maccabeus came on towns and villages without warning and burnt them. He occupied the key positions and inflicted many severe reverses on the enemy, choosing the nighttime as being especially favorable for these attacks. And his heroism was talked about everywhere. Well, that's certainly true that Maccabeus, Judas Maccabeus, was very successful in all of his revolting against the Syrians, and he was certainly the most famous of this whole family, whether you're talking about the father, whether you're talking about the sons. But the writer of 2nd Maccabees is setting it forth as though Judas Maccabeus was the organizer of all this. And if you turn back to 1st Maccabees chapter 2, we find out that he wasn't. He wasn't the organizer of all of this. He didn't even come on the scene as being very important until after the death of his father. This is what all of 1st Maccabees chapter 2 is about. The very first verse starts off that at this time there was a certain Mattathias who was the priest at Modin. And he had these sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, whom the elephant fell on top of, and Jonathan, who was one of the later ones that came on the scene. He comes after, of course, Judas. Anyway, we've read this before. We studied 1st Maccabees. It's Mattathias, the father, who is the one offered the chance of giving the sacrifice first. Since he's the leader in that town, it would set a good example for everyone else around there. Of course, he refuses, and we have the little squabble over that. And then skipping all the way down to verse 42, verses 42 through 48, we're going to see some verses about the organization of the rebels, and it's not done under Judas, it's done under Mattathias, his father. It was then that they were joined by a company of Hasidians, stalwarts of Israel, every one of them a volunteer in the calls of the law. And all who were refugees from the troubles came to swell their numbers and to add to their strength. Well, over there in 2nd Maccabees, it said they had 6,000. He doesn't, I don't think, give us a number, at least not right here. We don't know how many, but they're gathering a large group of men. When they had organized the force, they turned their wrath on the guilty men and renegades. Those who escaped their fierce attacks took refuge with the Gentiles. Mattathias and his friends. You see, it doesn't mention Judas until down in verse 66, because he passes the mantle of rebellion on from himself to Judas, his son, after he dies. But as long as Mattathias is alive, and he's alive during that period where those verses were speaking over in 2nd Maccabees, then Mattathias was the leader, not Judas. Mattathias and his friends then swept through the country, pulling down the pagan altars and forcibly circumcising all of the uncircumcised boys found within the frontiers of Israel. They hunted down their arrogant enemies. The cause prospered in their hands. Thus they saved the law from the Gentiles and their kings, and they broke the power of the tyrants. So we've got a contradiction here. And it's not like it was a minor one. I think we covered Timotheus being mentioned 2 times, one of those after he was already dead. And yet I guess it's like Abel, he being dead yet speaketh, because he's still alive later on over in 2nd Maccabees. But that's something minor. Here's something major. Because the books are entitled Maccabees, it has reference to the Maccabean revolt. And who starts all of it? According to one book, it's Judas. According to another book, it's his father, Mattathias. And the reliable account would have to assume is 1st Maccabees 2. And therefore the instigator of all of this would be the father, the leader of this family clan, would be Mattathias. So there's a major discrepancy over in 2nd Maccabees. Then another discrepancy is the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It simply can't be reconciled. The account, according to 2nd Maccabees 9, it simply can't be reconciled with the account in 1st Maccabees. And worse than that, it can't even be reconciled with another account given in the self-same book, 2nd Maccabees. So turn over to chapter 9. This is a rather lengthy account. We'll read as much of it as we need to. It's an interesting account of how, according to this author of 2nd Maccabees, Antiochus Epiphanes IV died, how he met his end. And it's not the same as over in 1st Maccabees, and neither is it the same as an earlier account right here in this book. And so why give us 3 different ways in which he died? He only died one of those ways. Starting with, this chapter, 2nd Maccabees 9, Antiochus has gone to Persia to attack the great city of Persepolis, which at that time was known to be the richest city of the world. He was going to attack Persepolis in Persia and, of course, take all of the treasures, the gold, the silver, the gems, all of the ornaments away from the city. When he gets there, all the citizens of the city come out and fight against him and his army, and they're too much for Antiochus. Verse 2, they're all routed by the citizens of Persepolis. So verse 4, transported with fury, he's mad because he couldn't take the city and get all the revenue. He conceived the idea of making the Jews pay for the injury inflicted by those who put him to flight. Now, it wasn't Jews that defeated him. It was Persians over there. But like sore losers do, they go and take the blame out on someone else instead of on themselves. He can't go back and attack the city because they've already defeated him once. So he resolves in his mind, I know how I'll take care of this and gain face in the eyes of those who are following me. We'll go back and ransack Jerusalem. We'll punish the Jews for what the Persians at Persepolis did to us. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until the journey was finished. Well, that's hardly impossible, driving from Babylon all the way to Israel without stopping. But riding with him, very good sentence here, because it pictures him riding along, and the writer says, but riding with him was divine judgment. For in his arrogance he said, when I reach Jerusalem, I will make it a common graveyard for the Jews. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him a fatal and an invisible blow. Now here's a little succinct description of his impending death. As soon as he had said the words, he was seized with incurable pain in his bowels and with sharp internal torments, a punishment entirely fitting for one who had inflicted many unheard-of torments on the bowels of others. By the way, this verse, among others, shows again that the probability would be in the favor of authorship by a Pharisee rather than a Sadducee, because the Pharisees believed in a very encompassing and very minute doctrine of the providence of God. And we see, I think, maybe 4 or maybe 5 times. We'll look at a couple of them. Here's one of them. 4 or 5 different times here in the book where the writer is very specific in pointing out whenever someone else dies, he points out, well, it's really fitting the way he dies because that's the very way he tried to kill others. And now God is taking his life in the same way, which shows that God's providence is all-encompassing and it's very minute. It goes down to the very circumstances of one's death. And here's one of those passages. He said it's entirely fitting that God smote him in his bowels because he had smitten others in their bowels. So he did not in the least abate his insolence. More arrogant than ever, he breathed fiery threats against the Jews. After he had given orders to speed up the journey, it happened. This is after this mystical internal disease, verse 5, that he contracted. They're going along so fast that he fell out of his chariot as it hurtled along, and so violent was his fall that every joint in his body was dislocated. Just really smashed him against the rocks on the ground. Just, you've heard about a slipped disc or something. Well, he had his whole body slipped out of joint. Which is a little bit preposterous to think that much could have happened. I mean, the most that could have happened, you'd strike your head on a rock and you'd be dead. He who in his pretension to be more than man had just been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea and weigh high mountains on scales was brought to the ground and had to be carried in a litter, thus making God's power manifest to all. Worms swarmed even from the eyes of this godless man. What does that remind you of in the New Testament? Herod in Acts 12. There's another one of those occasions where people say the New Testament borrowed in all of its myths from the myths of the apocryphal writings. Because he no sooner says these words up there in verse 5 and he's smitten. Well, the same thing happens to Herod. He gives this great oratorical speech and all the people shout and say it's the voice of a God, not of a man. We read that immediately an angel of the Lord smote him so that he was eaten of worms and died. Worms swarmed even from the eyes of this godless man. And while he was still alive and in agony, his flesh rotted off. The whole army was disgusted by the stench of his decay. It was so unbearably offensive that nobody could escort the man who only a short time before had seemed to touch the stars of the sky. So, this is two problems that he has. And so after this second one, in this broken state, Antiochus began to abate his great arrogance. Under God's lash and racked with continual pain, he began to see things in their true light. Well, sometimes it happens when you're on your back in the hospital bed, you get the light on things. He could not endure his own stench and said, "It is right to submit oneself to God, and being mortal, not to think oneself equal to him." Then the villain made a solemn promise to the Lord, who had no intention of sparing him any longer, and it was to this effect. This is what he swore that he would do. Jerusalem, the holy city, which he had just been hurrying to level the thing to the ground, he would declare a free city. That means free from all duty and taxes and tribute and so forth. To all the Jews whom he had not considered worthy of burial, but only fit to be thrown out with their children as prey for the birds and beasts, he would give privileges equal to those of the citizens of Athens. The holy temple, which he had earlier plundered, he would adorn with the most splendid gifts. He would replace all the sacred utensils on a much more lavish scale. He would meet the cost of the sacrifices from his own revenues. In addition to all this, he would turn to be a Jew and visit every inhabited place to proclaim God's might. He was going to become a Jewish missionary. When his pains in no way abated, because the just judgment of God had fallen on him, and he was in despair, then he wrote this letter to the Jews, saying what we essentially just read in the verses before. And then he tells us the conclusion down in verse 28. Thus, this murderer and blasphemer, suffering the worst of agonies, such as he had made others suffer, met a pitiable end in the mountains of a foreign land. So, in other words, he died. Well, he dies of this internal disease. He dies of every joint being dislocated. He dies of worms coming out of his eyes. He dies of a number of different diseases and different ailments. Then look back in chapter 1 of the same book, though. This is a very interesting contradiction, because he evidently is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. We're on the subject, verse 13, of Antiochus going to Persia to attack Persepolis. So it must be the same Antiochus, although he doesn't mention the whole name. He just calls him Antiochus in verse 14. Well, that's what he calls him everywhere else also. Verse 14, Antiochus, along with his companions, arrived at the temple to marry the goddess in order to secure the considerable treasury by way of a dowry. After this had been laid out by the priest, he went into the temple precinct with a small retinue. When Antiochus entered, the priest shut the sanctuary, opened a secret door in the paneling, and hurled stones at them. The king fell as if struck by a thunderbolt. They hacked off limbs and heads and threw them to those outside. Blessed in all things be our God, who handed over the evildoers to death. Well, there's an entirely different manner for his death. Now he's been attacked by these priests who had little secret hiding places in the temple over in Persia. They threw stones out and hit him in his head and killed him and then cut off his arms and his head. So that's a contradiction right in the same book. But then if you go back to 1 Maccabees, we'll find probably the more reliable account, if we're going to trust any of them, since 1 Maccabees is more reliable than everything else. It's probably more reliable in its occasion of Antiochus' death in 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verses 8 through 16. Well, we'll have to get the context of what he's talking about. It says, when the king heard this news. Well, he's in Persia, verse 5. The messenger meets him in Persia. Oh, I know what he's talking about here. The Maccabees have routed his general, Lysias, that he had sent upon Jerusalem, down in verse 7. By the way, I think if you go back to that account over there in chapter 9 of 2 Maccabees, the general that's in control is another general, Gorgias is the general over there. Now it's Lysias. And yet both of them are the commander-in-chief of the armies at the time of the death of Antiochus Epiphanes. So you couldn't have two that are at that position at the same time. So anyway, he's over in Persia. He sent someone to attack Jerusalem. They've been unsuccessful. So that's the news that verse 8 has reference to. When the king heard this news, he was thrown into such deep dismay that he took to his bed, ill with grief at the miscarriage of his plans. And there he lay for many days, his bitter grief breaking out again and again, and he realized that he was dying. So he summoned all his friends and said to them, "Sleep has deserted me. The weight of care has broken my heart. At first I said to myself, why am I overwhelmed by this flood of trouble? I who was kind and well-loved in the day of my power." Well, that's hardly true. Remember, that's coming from his own mouth, though. So that might be what he thought of himself, self-delusion. "But now I remember the wrong that I did in Jerusalem." Well, this could well be true, that he thought this, that he recognized why he was dying such a grievous death. He said, "I remember that wrong that I did whenever I took all the vessels of silver and gold, when I made an unjustified attempt to wipe out the inhabitants of Judea. It is for this I know that these misfortunes have come upon me, and here I am dying of grief in a foreign land." He summoned Philip, one of his friends, appointed him regent over the empire, and said, "Whenever I die, give the kingdom to Jupiter, Antiochus Jupiter, my son. He dies in the year 149, or for us, 162 BC. So that's not even anything like those two accounts of his death over in 2 Maccabees. Remember, the reason that we're looking at these various faults of 2 Maccabees is to show that it's not inspired scripture, especially when it can't even stay consistent from chapter 1 to chapter 9 in the same book.
Amen.
It's given us two entirely different accounts of the death of Antiochus IV. And here's a third, and different. None of them are the same. They're all different. We ought to have at least two that are the same, but three accounts, all three of which are different. And if any of them are reliable, it's probably the account over in 1 Maccabees. We can't check it out with anything else because you just don't find a lot of material that covers this period of history. But it sounds reasonable that God would have smitten someone as wicked and as impious as old Antiochus Epiphanes. It sounds reasonable that he would have died a death like this, and probably in the end recognizing the very reasons for his death. Now I want to come to two final errors of 2 Maccabees. Without a question, these are the two most serious deceptions of the book. I think the most interesting and important one historically had to do with the account of Jeremiah hiding the Ark of the Covenant. But these two are definitely of a religious nature, and these two are the two that have influenced people by means of the Roman Church so much throughout the centuries. The first of those, two more final errors, faults. They're really heresies according to New Testament doctrine of 2 Maccabees. The first of those being the doctrine of the prayers for the dead. Chapter 12. If you've got your Bible, and it's a totally complete Bible, then you can turn over there. Chapter 12, because this is a very interesting account. Prayers for the dead. Now, those of you who are former Catholics, what's another idea that comes into play right away whenever we're talking about praying for people who have already died? Okay, this is one of the initial foundations for the purgatorial concept in popery. You have to have the ability to be prayed for once you're dead in order to have any need of purgatory. So the two go together directly. If you've got purgatory, then you've got the possibility of earthly prayers being offered up for dead saints. And if you've got the possibility of prayers being offered for the dead saints, then you have to have purgatory. So the two have to go together. And the Catholics got this right out of 2 Maccabees chapter 12, verses 38 through 45. 2 Maccabees, remember that, not 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees. That's why I've been pointing out everything else that's wrong with the book. It's not trustworthy. It's not trustworthy historically, geographically. It's not trustworthy in any regards. And so why all of a sudden, whenever it can't even get the story straight of how Antiochus died, now we're going to be basing someone's eternal well-being on a few verses over here in chapter 12. And that's pretty precarious position to be in. When you can't trust the book in any other regard, and you're going to be trusting it to be right, that when you die, you're going to have another chance. That's what purgatory is all about. Once you die and you weren't quite good enough, once you die, you're going to have another chance. Okay, verse 38. Now remember, all of chapters 8 through 15 of this book are talking about Judas Maccabeus. So we're talking about Judas. He's been fighting against some of the generals that have been sent out by Antiochus Jupiter, which is the immediate son of Epiphanes. Regrouping his forces, he led them to the town of Adullam. The seventh day, this is Judas and his people. The seventh day was coming on. So they purified themselves as the custom dictated and kept the Sabbath there. Next day they went, as had by now become necessary, to collect the bodies of the fallen, that is, of their own comrades, in order to bury them with their relatives in the ancestral graves. But on every one of the dead they found under the tunic amulets, sacred to the idols of Jamnia. By the way, there's that city that doesn't appear in the Bible, but that's important with regard to the Old Testament canon. Objects which the law forbids to Jews. Here is again one of those places where the providence of God is all-encompassing. They died for a very, very specific reason. These Jews here that died in the battle. It was evident to all that here was the reason why these men had fallen. They had these little superstitions with them. Therefore they praised the work of the Lord, the just judge, who reveals what is hidden. And, turning to prayer, they asked that the sin might be entirely blotted out. The noble Judas called on the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened to the fallen because of their sin. He levied a contribution from each man and sent a total of 2,000 silver drachmas to Jerusalem for a sin offering, a fit and proper act in which he took due account of the resurrection. For if he had not been expecting the fallen to rise again, well, there very obviously is the doctrine of the resurrection, which the Sadducees didn't believe in, but the Pharisees did. So if he wasn't expecting them to be resurrected, then it would have been foolish and superfluous to pray for the dead. There it is, all summed up in one sentence. He's right on the resurrection here. He said, I'm expecting those that are fallen to rise again. But he's wrong on the intermediate state. Between now and when they rise, what's going to happen? Well, we don't know, but we can influence what's going to happen by praying for them. In the period, the intermediate period between now and the last resurrection. He said it would have been foolish and superfluous for me to pray for the dead. But since he had in view the wonderful reward reserved for those who die a godly death, then his purpose was a holy and pious one. And this was why he offered an atoning sacrifice to free the dead from their sin. That's purgatory. That's prayers for the dead, which is one of the basic doctrines of the Popish Church. Well, our Bible, Hebrews 9:27, tells us it's appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. It's appointed unto men once to die, and what comes next? Not an intermediate state where you get 1,400 years of chances that hopefully someone will do their rosary or something for you here on earth and get you some better rewards in the kingdom, get you out of that miserable purgatorial state. No, after that, after death, comes the judgment. Hebrews 9:27. I mean, it's a blasphemous statement made in verse 45 that he offered atoning sacrifice to free the dead from their sin.
That's right.
Every man has to confess his own sin personally. You can't have someone else do some type of sacrifice for you. You've got to make application yourself. Wouldn't that make it easy? We just all live an ungodly life, but make sure we had a holy grandmother. Well, yeah, that's the way a lot of people live.
That's right.
A lot of the rock and roll teenagers out there, they just, as long as I've got a pious relative somewhere in the family, I'll be okay. They think, especially if they've had any brushings against any Catholics before, they think, well, if I die, it's all right. Someone will be praying for me. Somehow, I'm going to get out of all of this. So what am I saying? I'm saying it just encourages a life of sin.
That's right.
Because your destiny doesn't depend on this life.
Amen. That's right.
Your destiny depends on your destiny. The next life depends on the next life, or really the pause between this life and the final next life. That's what your life depends on. So you can really do as you please now. But the author of Hebrews would contradict that. It's given unto men once to die, and after that the judgment. Not a 1,000-year period in hopes of someone praying and getting you out of purgatory. We find over in Acts chapter 13 in verse 39 that it's only by Jesus that we are justified, all who believe. We are justified from all things from which we could never have been justified by the law of Moses or by some atoning sacrifice that someone offers after we're already dead and gone. We find over in Acts chapter 13 in verse 39 that it's only by Jesus that we are justified, all who believe. We are justified from all things from which we could never have been justified by the law of Moses or by some atoning sacrifice that someone offers after we're already dead and gone. So there's a very interesting passage, one of the most interesting, theologically speaking, of 2nd Maccabees. Why do you think the Catholics so dearly love the Apocrypha and fight with you when you want to exclude it and they want to include it? Because you're taking out their only basis for their doctrine. You don't have a basis for it in the New Testament or in the Old, but you do in the period between the two. That's why they pick up these books and take these books right along with them. We could even hypothesize this was probably written by a good, faithful Catholic. Really, it wasn't, though. A lot of people like to believe you can live like you want to in this life, sow your wild oats, and you don't have to reap anything. A lot of people like to believe that, whether you're Catholic or not. And here's some old Jewish soul that like to believe that. Some Jewish soul wrote 2nd Maccabees, but it really does fit in good with Roman Catholicism. Encourages all types of vice and iniquity while you're in this life, as long as you can be guaranteed you'll have a righteous relative outlive you. Problem is, what if you outlive all your righteous relatives? You're in trouble. You don't have anyone left to pray for you then. To walk up St. Peter's on their knees and really do some penance for you. Yeah, that's what it's supposed to do, is shorten your stay in the intermediate state. But there's really no, and you have to understand what I mean. I'm saying in the context of studying what we are here in 2nd Maccabees, there really is no intermediate state. I mean, there is, in one regard, Luke 16 teaches that, but it's not an intermediate state where you've got a lot of different chances and options to either get into the kingdom or not. It's final after you die. You're either in the kingdom or you're not in the kingdom.
Amen.
And there's going to be a more final state after that. But once you die, Hebrews 9:27, once you die, that's it. You don't have any more chances after that. Doesn't matter how many people want to pray for you. Doesn't matter how many good deeds they want to do, how much money they want to give. That won't do you any good at all. Once you're dead, you're dead. Once you're gone, you're gone. Once you've sinned, you'll be judged for it after you die. But this says that this is why he offered an atoning sacrifice to free the dead from their sins. That is, back up in verse 40, those who had these amulets. He was trying to free them from the dead so that whenever they came back in the resurrection, they'd come back in the right way. Be prepared to enter into everlasting bliss and not into everlasting torment and doom. Okay, and the final, see, there's a serious theological error. And I remember a week or so ago in the paper, you read this every now and then, you know it's a good, faithful Catholic making the statement, talking about someone's death, and the last paragraph said that our prayers are with him. Your prayers won't do him any good now. I've seen that I don't know how many times. I just saw it this week again. Some article in the paper of someone who died, and they were interviewing a surviving relative. The relative said, our prayers are with him. Our prayers are with him. No, they're not either. Because it doesn't do any good once you're gone. It's given unto man once to die, and after that, you don't need any more prayers. They won't do any good. After that's a judgment. Well, another and a final heresy, another theological one. We saved the two serious heresies to to conclude with. Because you see, 2nd Maccabees would really be one of the favorite books of the Catholics, because here we've got two of their major doctrines. What is that? Well, we said just a moment ago, prayers for the dead, that is, prayers by the living for the dead. Now you just turn that around, prayers for the dead, prayers by the dead for the living. The effective intercession of the dead saints. You can either have prayers by the living for the dead, or prayers by the dead for the living. You see, here in chapter 12, it's teaching that those of us that are alive can affect the destiny of those that are now gone. Whereas in the second place, we want to look now at the fact, according to 2nd Maccabees, that those who are already gone, those who have died, can affect our destiny by their intercession. This is found over in chapter 15. This is the basis for the rise of the multitude of important saints in Catholic theology. You've got a saint that covers just about everything.
That's right.
You even have one for beer guzzlers.
That's right.
Happens to be old St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas. But yeah, you've got a saint that covers everything. A saint that'll pray for you for mercy in this area and for mercy in that area. And the angels will even pray for you. And above all, the Blessed Virgin. The Blessed Virgin will go before the throne of her Son and intercede on your behalf. So you've got to have a basis for that somewhere, and the Catholics do, back in mystical 2nd Maccabees, back in the Apocrypha, the effective intercession of dead saints. Because what if, like I gave you the hypothetical example a moment ago, you were depending on that righteous grandmother of yours, but you outlived all of them? Well, you're still safe, because the dead saints can pray for you. Doesn't that really work well? You can just like have a tree pray for you, anything. Doesn't matter whether you're dead or alive. They just annul death like it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't even affect the person. Doesn't matter whether you're dead or alive, everything works just the same. Well, chapter 15, verses 12 through 16. This is going to talk about that high priest, Onias, he was a good high priest. Onias III, that had been slain earlier. Let's see, verse 12 mentions his name. The former high priest Onias appeared. This, of course, is still talking about Judas. Remember, he's the main character from 8 through 15. He appeared to him, that great gentleman of modest bearing and mild disposition. Remember, he's been dead a long time now, Onias III. He's an apt speaker, an exponent from childhood of the good life. With outstretched hands, he was praying earnestly for the whole Jewish community. Here's old Father Onias. He's the one who's faithfully praying for the Jewish community. He's a good fatherly figure here. Next, there appeared in the same attitude a figure of great age and dignity, whose wonderful air of authority marked him as a man of the utmost distinction. Notice we don't have any horse thieves coming back and praying for us or anything, or any rapists or something like that, child molesters. It's always these godly, righteous men. You know, you wouldn't want to resurrect someone that's ungodly and get them to pray for you. It's always these godly men. Who is this? Onias said, this is God's prophet Jeremiah, who loves his fellow Jews. No, he didn't either. God told him 3 times in his book, don't pray for him anymore, Jeremiah. So how are we going to have him praying for him now that he's gone? That really contradicts the book of Jeremiah. 3 times in the book of Jeremiah, God said, I'm finished with them. I've wiped my hands of Israel. Don't even pray for him anymore. But you need a good, righteous Old Testament figure to do your interceding for you. And so they've got one, Jeremiah, who offers many prayers for our people and for the holy city. Jeremiah extended his right hand and delivered to Judas a golden sword, saying as he did so, take this holy sword, the gift of God, and with it crush your enemies. So here's again the popish doctrine of the effective intercession of dead saints. You've got 2 dead ones, Onias and Jeremiah. both of which are making effective intercession to the throne of God on behalf of the Jewish people. Well, again, let's enlighten ourselves from the book of Hebrews concerning intercession, concerning who does it, and where it's effective and where it's not. Hebrews chapter 7, beginning with verse 22. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. And they, speaking of the Old Testament priests, they truly were many priests, and the reason they were many is because once one died, someone else had to come on the scene because he wasn't effective after he died. That's what verse 23 is saying. They truly were many priests because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. So that one verse there is contradicting the effective intercession of dead saints. But this man, because he continueth forever, hath an unchangeable priesthood, wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing that he ever liveth to make intercession for them. So what it does in Catholicism is rob Jesus of his role of the interceding high priest of the believer. If you've got 15 trillion other saints up there and angels, and above them all the Blessed Virgin to do your interceding for you, you don't need his heavenly ministry. And yet we're told this is why, contrary to the Old Testament priest, he never dies. He lives forever. He has an unchangeable priesthood. And only those who come to God by him will be interceded for. You can go some other way, but you won't make it to the Father. I don't know where you'll end up, but you won't make it to the Father. You can call on, they've got saints, St. Christopher, St. Anne. You can call on all the saints that have their own little areas where they're supposed to minister for you, but probably 90% of them never did exist. I mean, a lot of them are just myths in the minds of Catholic followers, and those that did were probably horse thieves themselves.
Right.
So, and even if they weren't, their intercession is not going to do you any good. Such an high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. Romans chapter 8, the second of two passages that set forth his high priestly, present day, high priestly ministry of intercession. This is a great comfort to have. Catholics take comfort in the wrong thing. They take comfort in someone praying for them who probably doesn't even exist.
That's right.
Like St. Valentine's. How do we know St. Valentine's ever really lived? There's a couple of traditions that go back hundreds of years, but you can't trust that. The only thing you can trust is the Word of God.
Amen.
That's just like saying that you knew a fellow named Joe Smith that died a couple of years ago who was a righteous man, and he's going to pray for you now. Well, that's ignorant to believe a doctrine like that. Verse 34, who is he that condemneth? It is Christ that died, yea, that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God. Doesn't say anything about the Blessed Virgin being at the right hand of God. He is at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. There's not a verse in our Bible, only in the Catholic Bible, there's not a verse for the effective intercession of dead saints. Jesus is taken right out of his ministry. If this is true, and that's exactly what the Catholic Church has intended to do and what they've been very successful in for many, many centuries, is get him out of his role and put someone else there who God never intended to be there. Like Jeremiah. Jeremiah was effective while he was here. Moses was effective while he was here. But we can't have any of those Catholic notions of comfort that whenever we're going through some difficult trial, and those of you who've been brought up in the Popish church would be more inclined than those of us who were not to even think of having some comfort that someone up there is praying for you. Maybe, hopefully, there'll be about 500 different saints, angels, different creatures up there. And maybe you can do enough Hail Marys and Our Fathers that it'll be the Virgin herself that'll go before her Son and command him to do certain things for you. Well, there's only one mediator between men and the Father, and it's the man, Christ Jesus.
Oh, praise God.
1 Timothy 2, verses 5 and 6. There's only one mediator between men and the Father, and that's the man Christ Jesus. He's the only mediator. There's no other intercessor. There's no other mediator. You can ask Peter whenever you get there, and he'd be the first to tell you he's never prayed a word for you about anything. And neither has Mary. You can ask her when you get there. They're too busy doing things up there to be concerned about us wretches down here on the earth. I mean, that'd be depressing to have to be up there praying with all of these numbskulls down here on the earth. The book of Isaiah said this life doesn't even come into mind again. Isaiah, the last few chapters of the book of Isaiah. So they're certainly not going to be wasting their time thinking about all of our problems that we have. They'd be living all of our life themselves. They lived enough themselves. Leave them alone. Let the saints stay in heaven. People are wanting to bring them back down here and get them. It's like whenever you go through a trial, you take half the family through with you. Well, that's what you end up doing. You take half of heaven through your trials with you. And all you need is one, the great high priest. He goes with you through your trials because he's interceding. And even if someone else was going with you through it, they can't do anything about your trial, though. It's all in the sovereign hands of God. So why not go through God instead of through one of those lesser saints up there? And all of them, even the highest one's a lesser saint than God himself. Go through him. So here's two chief theological heresies. Prayers for the dead, prayers by the dead. Chief heresies of 2nd Maccabees. That's why it's important to look at the book whenever we study those doctrines later in Popish theology. Then you'll already know where they have their origins. Back here in mystical 2nd Maccabees. And remember, it's the same book where the angels sick the horses that hoof people down to the ground. And anytime someone talks about prayers for or by the dead, say, yeah, I read that. That was a few chapters after those horses were hoofing some people down. So that really makes a lot of sense to me, both of those stories. Like Christian comics, it's really fun to read, but I don't put a lot of faith or trust in either one of them. Well, we've got a little time left. Let's look at 3rd Maccabees. 3rd Maccabees. We're just going to briefly mention these other books of Maccabees because they're not officially part of the Apocrypha. 3rd Maccabees is not in the Apocrypha, therefore it's not in the Catholic Bible, but it's still read in the Greek church down to this day. Now, it doesn't detail the exploits of the Maccabean brothers like the other two books have, because it reaches a little bit earlier in history. But it seems like by the time this book, 3rd Maccabees, was written, the name Maccabee had come to be synonymous with the term martyr. So that books that dealt with martyrdom or persecution would just automatically, for the Jews, be named Maccabees because of the martyrdoms that we have in 2nd Maccabees. Here's what the book is about, just a brief account. Let's see, if you got your chart, maybe you can get that out. We'll find how early we go. Ptolemy the Fourth has defeated in the year 217 Antiochus the Third. The Battle of Raphia. It's right there on the map, on the chart. Ptolemy the Fourth has defeated Antiochus the Third in 217. And on his way back to Egypt from Syria, of course, he has to pass through Palestine. And as he goes through Israel and comes nigh to the city of Jerusalem, he has an insatiable desire to enter into the Holy of Holies in the temple. And so he tries to do that, but he's prevented by the Jews in Israel. As a result, he goes back home, pouting like a 5-year-old boy that he didn't get to go into the Holy of Holies, and wreaks his vengeance on the Jewish people who are his subjects in Egypt. There are a lot of Jews, remember, living in Egypt at this time. So we're back around 200 B.C., a little earlier than both of the other books of Maccabees when these events are taking place. As far as the book being written, it was probably written sometime after 2nd Maccabees, but no one really knows. So because he wasn't allowed to go into the temple, he comes back into Egypt and wreaks his vengeance on the Jews there. And they are protected by a series of miracles. I'm just going to quickly go over the miracles. Very interesting miracles again. It's a very fanciful, mystical book, as we have grown accustomed to find in the Apocrypha. What he wants to do is, first of all, he takes away their citizenship, then he brands all of them with a hot branded iron of an ivy leaf, and that still doesn't make them succumb to the Hellenistic way of life, and so he decides he's going to just get rid of a lot of them. And he wants to gather all of the Jews in Egypt together in Alexandria. And so here are some of the miracles. In the first place, he commands his court historians, his court scribes, to take the names down of all the Jews who live in Egypt. And once they get their names down, they're going to round all of them up and bring them into the Hippodrome in Alexandria. So they set about this task for 40 days until finally they run out of pens and paper. They run out of their papyri and they run out of their reed pens, so that foils that attempt to get an enumeration of all the people. So there's the first miracle. They ran out of their notebook paper. So when you run out of that, you can't write down any more names. A second miracle. King Ptolemy IV commanded his followers to drug 500 elephants with giving them a lot of wine to drink. Then he's going to take these 500 elephants in the Hippodrome where the Jews have been gathered together, and they're going to, of course, slaughter all of the Jews, trample them to death. He appoints this to be done one night, and it's going to be done the next morning. You see, at night, he's getting all of this taken care of, and they get the elephants in there, and they're going to drug them, and then whenever morning time comes, they're going to take all the Jews in there and kill them. Well, the king got a severe case of needing some sleep, and he slept all the way through the next day, all the way to the next night, whenever he had a banquet planned. And so, of course, he couldn't fail to show up at the banquet, so that ruined his plans for that day. The third miracle, he postponed it from that day, after he slept all the way through it, to the next day. He said the next morning we'll kill all the Jews. So he wakes up the next morning, all of the elephants are ready, all of the Jews are ready, and then the king has forgotten why he got all of the elephants ready. And so he chided the keepers of the elephants for making them drink so much wine and get drunk, and why they rounded all 500 of them up together in the Hippodrome. So it's a loss of memory. He forgot why he had this done. Then he remembers that night. He said, oh, I remember now. He had another banquet that night. So he remembers that second night why he had it done, so he said, okay, we'll do it the next morning. So the fourth and final miracle, they've got all of the elephants there. They've got all of the Jews from Egypt in the Hippodrome in Alexandria. The king hasn't overslept. The king hasn't forgotten what he was going to do. And so just as the elephants are sicked upon the people, two big, huge, mighty angels appear from the sky and stand in front of the elephants and encourage the elephants to turn around and trample all the soldiers behind them. So the elephants do that, and the king recognizes he was making a mistake by attacking the Jews. He was acting boyishly and childishly. So he repents and lets all the Jews off the hook. That's what 3rd Maccabees is about. Fanciful accounts by these Jews. They should have just believed the law of Moses and the prophets. Okay, 4th Maccabees. Mention a thing or two about 4th Maccabees. The book's divided up, it's 18 chapters, into 3 equal parts. I have to give you the parts to explain what the book is about. The first 12 verses of chapter 1 give us the theme and the purpose of the entire book, which is a speculative treatment of man's reason and will. A speculative treatment of man's reason and will. With the question being asked, can the rational will connected with a pious life overcome all passions, all of your internal or external personal passions? Can the rational will connected with a pious life overcome all of your passions? teaching the doctrine of good works. Then the second part of the book, we have chapter 1, verse 13, through chapter 3, verse 19. This is the philosophical section of the book, where we have the philosophical discussion of this question: can the rational will connected with the pious life overcome all of your passions? And it centers in Plato's 4 cardinal virtues of wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, which we've talked about in ethics. Philosophical discussion of the book's question: can the rational will connected with a pious life overcome all passions? They take Plato's 4 cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance to arrive at their answer. Then chapter 320 through 1820, which is the last verse in the book, 1820. Here the author reviews the Maccabean martyrdoms, especially those of the 7 brothers and their mother in 2 Maccabees 7. In answering the prevailing question, can the rational will connected with a pious life overcome all passions, with the answer yes. The rational will can overcome by one's will, by one's own determination. As long as you live a religious life, by your own determination, you can overcome all of your faults, all of your temptations, which is a heretical book. So the author of the book would say that the Maccabees are the best examples of the affirmative answer to this question. Now Eusebius and Jerome both knew of 4th Maccabees, and they followed a then current tradition that the book was written by Josephus. But that's false. It was written by a Greek. It was written in Greek by an Alexandrian Jew, sometime around the time of 3rd Maccabees, which was sometime after 2nd Maccabees, which was somewhere maybe in the end of the 1st century BC. It's really a little sketchy on all of them, just because we don't have any more information. And finally, 5th Maccabees. There's 5 books of Maccabees, only 2 of those being important. 5th Maccabees is kind of reliable. It's kind of like 1st Maccabees in being historically reliable. It's an account of Jewish history from the time of Heliodorus. Remember, we talked about him in 2 Maccabees 3. He was the one sent to take the treasury. He was prevented from doing that by those horses from the angels. So it's an account of Jewish history from the time of Heliodorus and his attempt to plunder the treasury of the temple around 180 BC, down to the death of Herod the Great around 4 BC, which is around the same time as the birth of Christ. It seems like the original of the book was written in Hebrew, probably by a Jew in Israel. And probably it was written after the fall of the city and the temple in AD 70. Now the author of the book speaks of an original author of the material, which means that his must be a recension of the earlier edition of 5th Maccabees, which would probably mean that the original author lived maybe a few years prior to the fall of the city of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. Because the footnote by the one who's giving us the recension seems to include a reference to the fall of the city and the temple, but the original work doesn't, which points to the fact that possibly one lived just prior to it and one lived just after it. Not a lot's known about the book because people really haven't paid much attention to it, including scholars. But what is known about the book seems to be a fairly reliable account of Jewish history for the last 2 centuries BC, the last 2 centuries prior to Christ. But like I say, now 3rd, 4th, and 5th Maccabees really aren't that important because they're not part of the Apocrypha. Only the first 2 books of Maccabees. With that being said, then we come to a conclusion of looking at the books of Maccabees.